Right, thank you very much. Welcome to this session about the SDK for building apps on CDS. So in this session, we're going to go through a few things. These are the objectives that we have set for you. We want you to understand at the end of the session how the common data service that you've been hearing a lot about, that's been the focus of many sessions here, how you can leverage that with the SDKs that we have built for you to use. So these SDKs, as you will learn, are useful for you when you want to build business logic based on data that's in the cloud in your CDS. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here pertains, the business goals that we're going to talk about pertain to both the C# and JavaScript SDKs that we're building, and in fact, as you will learn, any language binding that you could think of. But some of the things that we will go into a little more depth will be dealing with C# in particular. So the idea here is that you use these to build performant code, and performant is a key feature here. You will see this permeate throughout the design of this SDK. Performant code against the data that you store in the cloud. So this is what we're going to go through. We're going to walk you through some scenarios. We're going to deal with the C# SDK. We're going to show some code examples, and we're going to do some demos. And hopefully it's going to be fun and interesting for you to see. We'll see. Okay, meet your presenters. Myself, Peter Willitsen. I am an old hand in this. I've been working in this space for a long time. I was primarily involved in the AX, the Dynamics 365 for operations development stack in Visual Studio. I was doing a lot of work with X++, and I still am. But I have sort of also been working a lot with the SDK that we see today, and with a Maker portal that we'll see some examples of a little bit later. I'm proud to have with me today Nima. Nima, take it away.
Hey guys, I'm working on CDS and ALM, SDK and ALM for CDS. And I used to be an engineer on AX, working on AIF and web services. So it's a natural transition to work on the CDS.
It also means that when you have really hard questions, we have somebody to actually answer them. We have Robert in the room here as well, my esteemed fellow PM, as is Nima. And the three of us will probably be able to answer most questions that you may have. Okay, let's walk through the scenarios. Take it away, Nima.
All right, so when we were building the CDS SDK, we had a few scenarios in mind. First of which that we're focusing on was when you have Power Apps working with CDS, you can do basic CRUD, so the Power Apps can write data, read data. There's a missing piece, though. So you can't really do complex business logic. And we enable this by allowing you to use the SDK with an Azure function or a web service, and using a custom API from the Power App to be able to do those complex business logic pieces. The second scenario that we focused on, and this is really probably the most common for developers, is being able to write a console app against against CDS. This category kind of involves also writing web services that are generally used by other services. So take an example of the demo that we're going to do with the mobile device. The mobile device can call into a service which then talks into CDS, and that's sort of what this scenario involves also. And then the other set of scenarios are very, very much enterprise focused. You could have multiple systems connecting to the CDS. We do have separate support for data sync between systems. But in addition to that, you could, orchestrate some kind of business event resulting in data going in and out of CDS. And those are things we focus on as we go along.
So let's just stay a little bit on that, if you don't mind. So look at the power of this thing. You have a synchronization feature that allows you to take data from, in this case, Dynamics AX, and make it available in the CDS space as well. So all your Power Apps and all the flows and all the logic apps and all that stuff that you will build actually works on that data as well. It's a very powerful thing where you have all this data shared with these synchronization things. And there's more power to be had by this trigger and notification logic that we will be talking about a little bit later, where you can react to things changing in your data and build business logic against that. That's also a very powerful feature. So there's a lot of goodness in here. This is sort of details a lot of the value that you can get out of CDS in general in just 5 little boxes with some arrows between them. So that's good stuff there. So let's just get this straight. I mean, I've said this a million times, but I'm going to say it again. At this session and at many others, the purpose of the SDK is to enable developers to rapidly develop apps consuming data in CDS. That's all it is. All it is. That's a big statement. So what were the goals for us when the team was handed this task to build this SDK? What were the business goals that were handed down to us? Well, you have to have a C# API that's optimized for developer productivity. So we have to leverage stuff that people already know in terms of the programming languages that we're targeting this against. We have to have any and all functionality that is available be interacted with using this SDK. So it's not just CRUD. It's also all the metadata that defines all the entities and pick lists and other artifacts that will live out there in the cloud. All those have to be available as well. You have to be able to create an entity by going through that layer, as well as consuming CRUD. It has to be the whole story. There has to be nothing outside of the SDK that you need to manipulate these things, to interact with them. It has to be complete. It has to be designed, it is designed for excellent performance. And you will, as you use the SDK, you will come across some things that you will say, why did they do it this way? And every time you have that thought, the answer is because of performance. You'll see some examples. I'll point them out as we get through them. One of them is that you can't do the corresponding thing of select star from, where you select all the fields irrespective of how many there are. It's just not possible in the SDK that we've built. And, we could certainly do it. But experience shows that when people do that, they fetch hundreds of fields over the wire and they use only 3. So we don't want that. So we've made a lot of decisions to make sure that people don't shoot themselves in the foot in terms of performance. So when you have these questions, the answer is performance. But we're not going to stop with relational data. So in AX today, as you know, you have relational data. You have a SQL, Azure database that has tables with rows and all that relational stuff and foreign keys and all that good stuff that we've known for how many years? Since '62 when Cod made his first book on the subject. But that doesn't cut it today. It's not enough. It's certainly a good start, and we have to do that. A lot of data fits very well into that mold, but not all data does. Today, there are document databases where you can store stuff. There's graph databases where material that fits naturally there should go there. And there's stuff, images and so on, that really are blobs that don't fit naturally in a relational database. So there's something called Azure Blob Storage, and we need to be able to manipulate that as well. So the story is not just restricted to relational data as it is in AX. In Dynamics 365 for operations. I'm going to say this wrong, right? I'm not going to apologize for it anymore. So the SDKs that we're going to show here are impressive in what they do. I really think they are. But let's just sit back and realize and be honest with each other and note that these are just very thin layers of abstraction over something really rich that is behind the scenes. In fact, everything that you do with the SDK, you could equally well do by building some JSON documents and sending them to a particular endpoint. So all the SDK does is it provides an interface that allows you to build these more easily. That's a way of looking at the SDK, which means that, if you need a JavaScript way of looking at this thing, we can ship you a JavaScript SDK easily. And in fact, we're building just exactly that. But you will be able to build bindings towards any language that you want, because the abstraction layer the layer is very thin. All it does is a well-defined generation of some JSON trees that we send to endpoints. Isn't that an interesting point? Am I right? Is that what it does? We'll see. We'll see. So let's just show how that works in practice. So here on the let me see, on your left-hand side, you see these SDKs that are running. So each of these 3 boxes out here, you should really see the different scenarios that we lined up for you before. They each fit into this mold. In this case, we just did the example with a web browser. But what they do is they send and receive data from this runtime endpoint that we have set up. So they all talk to that. And once it's inside, we take that JSON and we deconstruct it and we analyze it and do stuff. And what it eventually ends up with is translating into data queries against the backend of choice. So everything we're going to show now, of course, is going to be SQL, but it doesn't have to be that way as I've described. Now, you can take my word for it, or Nima can show you. And I think what you prefer is Nima showing you, right?
I guess so. How are you guys? So I'm going to show you guys what Peter was describing. We have the SDK running, but in the background, interesting stuff is happening. So we're going to look at what the payload's going to be, the HTTP payload, and what's happening with the service. So I have a simple scenario here. It's just a CRUD of a standard entity that comes with CDS. We're going to run this and start watching what's happening on Fiddler. This is going to show us what's happening on the wire.
So Fiddler is just a middleman that monitors everything that goes over the network, so we can actually see exactly what goes from one endpoint to the other.
You saw a little ghost box come and go away. That was me being logged in as me. A few of the first interactions that you see here are related to that. They're calls to Azure AD to authenticate. And there's a point here where CDS has a very hard dependency on Azure AD. Everything you do with the CDS, you have to be logged in as you.
Can you make the screen bigger? Somehow show bigger?
Make the screen bigger.
Do the trick from yesterday?
Unfortunately not. I can try and copy-paste the contents later for you. So this is where Peter was saying if you sit in the front, you're going to
Remember I did say that.
So then you have this other interaction, which is really for discovering where your CDS instance is. And it gives the SDK a list of all the instances that are out there that you have access to. And the SDK will use the URI of the specific runtime that you're accessing. The subsequent calls are all the CRUD interactions that I was talking about. So the first one is a query. Hopefully you can see this. If you can't see this, I'll try to describe it. But it's a description of a query that's going in as the request. From clause, project clause, where clause, and on the where clause it says name equals surface or name equals phone. The result comes back as another JSON that describes the metadata of what's coming back, name, category, ADA, etc. It also has the encoded data that will come back in this format. I won't go through all of these, but basically it's very similar. All of CRUD will look like JSON commands. So this is two delete commands in the same command in one transaction. This one is two insert commands in one transaction. Again, all of this is structured JSON. So the point Peter was making about you could write your own client in another language that does all of the things that the SDK does. All you need is to be able to authenticate, where Azure AD has already provided a bunch of libraries and pretty much all the important languages, so you can use that to log in. And then you can use the HTTP JSON capabilities to redo exactly what the SDK does for your specific scenario.
Yeah, okay. Let's take it back to my screen, could you? Sure.
So you say Azure AD. Is the scope limited to one tenant only, or can you do something across different customers, for example?
Every interaction is limited to one database, which lives in one tenant. You could theoretically use the SDK against multiple tenants, but you would have to authenticate and configure against each of those instances.
So basically, this whole session will be assuming that we're in one Azure tenant.
Yes.
Fair, yes.
Okay, fine.
So let's take a little bit of time to think about this thing with the JSON documents. because it means that I can buy myself a $5 chip, Raspberry, that knows how to do some primitive C++, and I can do string operations to build JSON documents. I can send it off in a network with HTTP requests that every platform in the civilized world knows. The HTTP protocol is the most common protocol in the world, right? So I can do my string operations, I can build my JSON documents, I can do my sending and receiving. So there's no limit to the kind of device that can talk like over this. There really isn't. It's a very, very flexible thing because we use all these very well understood and very, very common protocols. That's an important point. Yes, sir?
Yeah, you talk a lot about JSON here. With your SDK, the IntelliSense and all that would help you understand what you have access with. Are you documenting well as JSON basis for us to build?
Yeah, so good point. So the question was, you talk a lot about this JSON, but can we actually use it? Did you actually go and document exactly what these look like? And the answer to that question, like unfortunately other answers that I'm going to have to give along the way, is that we're not there yet. It means that we will do so. We know that this is an important thing. When you talk about or ease of authoring, it's certainly true that the SDK will provide you a better experience right now. And you can always do as Nima just did and look what it looks like over the network and then take it from there.
To add to that,
Something like Swagger file for service?
Say again?
Is the goal to have something like Swagger file, or how they call it now, Open API? Basically, something like WSDL for services.
So I think the question is, are we going to have something like a namespace that defines clearly what the vocabulary that we express in the JSON is?
Well, this is a standard for services.
Okay.
Which you can then use for code generation.
so I'm going to start with this one. Really, the API on the SDK right now, you saw there's an execute method, and it's very weakly typed. So it won't be easily described in Swagger. To your question, we are probably not going to focus on the API as of now. We're going to focus on the SDK and the API to keep that constant and support that first until we figure out what the API behind it is going to be and fix that, and then we will document at that point. So it will be a little bit later.
Yep. Okay. Moving along, there is a concept called triggers and notifications that I will talk about, even though we're not quite finished with it. As you may know from your experience with Dynamics 365 for operations, one of the big new things there was the fact that you could, on a table, specify event handlers that reacted to when things happened. Remember that? You can copy and paste, and you can have these handlers, and you're called on inserting, inserted, all this whole infrastructure that we built. That was quite well received, and it was proven very useful. So we thought, let's do something like that here. So whenever CRUD commands, or maybe CUD commands more than CRUD commands, but anyway, when they happen, you can enlist to be notified when something happens to those. So whenever I do an insertion, I can make sure that some C# code that I write is triggered when that happens. And there's two ways this can happen. There is the trigger and notification. The notification is a fire and forget thing, where we say, yeah, okay, goodbye, I've told you, now do your thing. And it doesn't matter how long it takes, I don't want to know, I don't care. I notified you, do your stuff. The other one is triggers that run within the context of an actual transaction. And that's where we need to be a little more careful about the performance. So what happens, as you can imagine, between the CDM service and the CDM client we have there is a network boundary, as you can understand. So there is some intelligence, a lot of intelligence that goes into sending back the payload to whoever needs to be notified about this. All these are web calls involving network latency and all sorts of other issues. So it's not an easy, they don't run in the same process. So it's not an easy thing to do. And we're certainly working on it. It's an exciting project. So let's focus a little bit on the C# SDK. What does it allow you to do? Well, it allows you to do data access over entities. Of course, that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. It also allows access to metadata, defining entities and pick lists and all that good stuff. And it supports these data triggers that I just briefly mentioned. So let me spend a few minutes talking about the design of the C# SDK. So there were several choices we could have made. We could have made this an API. We could have said, oh, we have this class here, and this is the way you use it, and so on. We chose not to do that. It's not just an API. Really what it is it's domain-specific language that's built within C# itself. That's what we did. And this has some repercussions on how you use it and how you learn it and how it works that are interesting. It happens to leverage all the good stuff that C# has to offer today. It uses vars, it uses lambdas, it uses the asynchronous methods facility with await and async and all that stuff. Some of the inspiration we got from LINQ. LINQ, the language integrated query that's part of C#. But we went our own paths a little bit and built something. I like to call it Blink. Instead, I call it business language integrated query, and I thought that was sort of fancy and fun, so that's what I did. I don't know, the product team doesn't know this yet, so they'll probably sue me for it. Anyway, but it is adapted to business scenarios, not just general scenarios. So one example is that you can't do this, as I said, all the select star. Another thing is that by default string comparisons, if you do a where name equals to Jones, the string comparisons will be case insensitive because we think that's the more common scenario in business applications. There are several of these decisions that we made to make this a business-focused scenario. But let's take the time just to consider something that you may not realize. When you write a query in Dynamics 365 for operations X++, you will do select blah, blah, blah from where table dot field, all that good stuff. And you have a guarantee that whenever you compile that thing and it compiles cleanly, that it will run cleanly and get the data that you need. That's a guarantee that we make. How can we make that guarantee? How is it possible for the X++ language to make such a strong guarantee?
By validating as metadata, which is synced to the database.
Yes. Well, I'll take it one step further. I'll say that the X++ language has intimate knowledge of the environment against which it works. It knows about the data stack that lies underneath it. It knows exactly what the capabilities are, and it will not allow you to express a query that lies outside of the capabilities of the underlying data layer. Right? That's a strong guarantee. You do not have this guarantee in LINQ or in Blink even. There may be cases where you can make a query that will compile, but it will have unexpected results when you run it. Because you cannot really, we really try as much as we can to make it syntactically impossible to express things that make no sense. But it's not possible to do that entirely. So when you give a lambda expression to the thing, the C# compiler will check that it fulfills the basic requirements of number of parameters and the types and all that stuff that the C# compiler does for you. But it won't know whether the backend can actually interpret this and make it into a where clause into a particular database. The C# compiler has no idea. And that's an interesting point in my opinion. So let's go really out and say, what does a really complex query look like? And this one is quite complex. We'll dig in a little bit more detail, not in this complex one, but here you have some employees that you join against regions and departments and benefits. And then you do a group by first name, last name, and country, region, and department name. And then you do aggregations over the count of the employees. And you calculate the total vacation hours as the sum here, and this is a calculated field. And then you do where clauses that you add together, where the first name is John, and so on. And here you're working over the aggregated fields, and you only want the guys who have vacation hours greater than 100. Then you do some order bys here, and you do a projection, and then you skip the first 100 values, and you take the next 25. Yes, sir?
We talked about also the case
Yes, I did. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. You have to be a little tricky about it, but yes, there is. So this is generally what this kind of thing looks like. The question was, I was very cocky and said that this is a business thing, so string comparisons are insensitive, case insensitive. Is there a way to do it sensitively, to be sensitive about it, so to speak? And yes, there is. It just takes a little bit of doing. Another thing that's interesting, one of the problems that people typically have with Dynamics 365 for operations in X++ is that they deal with transactions. And transactions are a very complicated thing in X++. You have the concept of TTS begin and TTS end, and as you can, or TTS commit, sorry. And that starts and ends a transaction, and you can do a rollback. And there is some really, really complicated interactions between that and exceptions. So when exceptions are thrown, you roll back in interesting ways, except if it's an update or a duplicate key exception or an update conflict. Those two just happen not to count in this thing. It's very, very complicated, and we have lots of best practice rules that we run and that we try to weed out the worst offenders of this. But it's an area that's very troublesome. Also, there's nothing stopping you from doing TTS begin, then calling a method call that you don't know how long it takes, and then a TTS end afterwards. So that call could last for hours while you go to lunch, right? Or it could show a dialogue. Do you want to do this? And you sit there, do I want to do this? And at the same time, the transaction keeps running. This is an untenable situation. We have to do something about that. We couldn't perpetuate this model into this new space that we're having. So we said, yeah, transactions, they're great, we need them, but they're not a first-class citizen in our world. You can't actually start and end a transaction on your own. What you can do is you can do everything in batch. Now, batch is not the same as it is in AX, of course. But what you do is you say, I want this record, this record, this record, and this record to be part of this operation. And all that happens on the client side. And then when you say, now I want to read or update or whatever it is I want to do, it takes all that stuff, it wraps it together in a big snowball or a package, and it sends it over this thing, as you saw the JSON documents just before. And then on the other side, what's going to happen is you're going to unpack this, so you have it in memory. Then you're going to do a start transaction, do the thing, and end transaction, and send back the result. So the transaction scope is going to be as small as we can possibly make it, which is part of the way that we can achieve maximum performance. Remember, I keep saying that performance was our key driver for this, right? And this is one of the reasons, or one of the implications, rather, of that. It's an interesting thing. This batch can do parallel or sequential or transactional. In parallel, we just say, yeah, we have a few processors lying around. Let's spawn off a thread and just do it there. Sequential is pretty much the same, but we guarantee that we do it in order at least. And transactional is where you do all in one transaction, which is going to be the most common one. But it can react in all three of these scenarios. Yes, sir?
Well, all these years, then transactions usually, help you do bulk operations and do it faster. But now you're saying you should always do one record at a time.
No, I did not say one record at a time.
Okay.
No, I said you collect on the client side the number of, it could be thousands of records that contribute to this. You collect them all, but the point is you collect them on the client. Then you package them together and send them over, and they are all acted on at the same time.
Okay, great.
Do any of you, let's just as a show of hands, how many of you have worked with X++ before? Hands up. This is what I like to see. This is what I like to see. Great. So that's good. So do any of you remember a feature that we put into Dynamics AX6, I believe, that allowed you to do something like this? Record insert list is one. Sir, down there? Yes, exactly. This was a feature that we built to do that exact same thing, unit of work, where you can, the model is pretty much the same. You add and add and add and add and add, and then you say, okay, now do it, instead of doing it grip-wise. So that's perfect. I'm glad somebody remembered down there. Matters. So data types. This is a business thing, right? It's a business thing. It's not link. So a language like C# has a requirement where it supports all types that are useful in general development. So it knows all about ints and strings and longs and GUIDs and all the good stuff. Did I say strings? I'll say it again. Doesn't matter. All the good stuff that you know from C#. But when you're working in an enterprise space building business apps, that's not enough. That's a subset of what you need. So we took the opportunity to build some business types that you can operate on. So some of these business types are encrypted strings, for instance. Blobs contain images or whatever it is you want. You have relational entity references, which is just pointers back to your 1 to n relationship. Makes that easy to work with. There is things like location. The site may have a particular location, which is latitude and longitude. Those are seen as one, but you can take the latitude and longitude out if you want to. The same thing, even better example, is person name. That has given name, surname, I think it has title as well, some interesting stuff like that. And there's even a provision where you can have a little snippet of JSON that you apply to this so that it's stored together with this particular name. If there is a regional convention where, I know that in the US, some people like to have the third after their title, if it's the third time somebody's called that in their family, to avoid any sort of, it's pretty stupid really, but they, yeah, whatever. It is what it is. I happen to be the 5th Peter in my family, so I know. But so maybe you wanted to add something like this, and you can add that as a JSON snippet, and it follows the data wherever it goes, even when it's stored in the database. So we provide these types of fields, but they're extensible as well. Address is the same thing. It contains 5 or 6 things about city, country, county, zip, all that stuff, but you can add extra things to them. Addresses are very different in different countries, as you know. Counties, for instance, have different semantics. So we will be talking about some common entities. When you are building your ERP app, please go ahead and look if there are any out-of-the-box entities available that satisfy your requirement, because using them is much easier. They're well documented. They are built to match your requirements. It's not something we pull out of a hat. They say, oh yeah, they'll probably need this. A lot of thought has gone into building these out-of-box entities. And they really are fairly complete in their individual area. And now somebody in the back of the room says, yeah, well, you only have 70 of them, right? So how can I possibly do that? Well, the water cooler conversations that I've had with the team who are building this tell me that I need to do something about the Maker portal because they'll have 500 of these in the next few months. So this is an area that you will see a lot of growth happening there. Our intention is that for almost any sphere of interest, any domain that you are building an ERP app, there should be out-of-box entities that allow you to do that. If there isn't, then we did not do well on that criterion. And remember, even if there's something there that you like but you need to add some stuff, you can always add stuff to the predefined entities. There's an extensibility story there. So there'll be 500 very soon, so you should consider doing that. Nima, could you talk about authentication and authorization for us a little bit?
So we talked a little bit about authentication, how it's based on Azure AD, basically. So that's the hard requirement. But then on the other side of it, what do we do with that authentication information? Basically, we have the same model between CDS and Power Apps and any other application that uses CDS for authorization. You can manage It's coming. I switched. You can manage the authorization to your entities from today from the Power Apps portal. So you would go to Power Apps, you would go to Admin Center. Under there, you would go to your environment. And there you have security settings exposed to you. If you have, it sounds like everybody's used AX, so we had a set of security resources or metadata. In this case, okay, so we're having some technical issues, but I'll describe it for you. So we had roles, permission sets, duties, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have all of that. We only have a subset, so we have roles and permission sets in CDS. Permission set is really just a mapping of entities to the actions that you can do on those entities. So let's take a look at an example. This example would be like account view permission set, which maps the account entity and the account groups entity with actions like read, for example. It's basically a grid of these associations. And then on the other side, you have roles that you can define. Okay, we're missing. Basically, the role is a collection of permission sets, and then you can assign users to those specific roles, same as AX. And again, the key is that whether you use the SDK, you use Power Apps, you use any other app that uses CDS, all of these things will be enforced. So actually,
yeah, okay. Let's go back. Okay. You do the demo?
Done.
We're good? Oops. Did this stop working? I switched it on. Good. All right. So we did the demo. Let's go to some in-depth code a little bit here and see where that brings us. This is even slightly too large, isn't it? Oops, I can't see. How long was it blue? For a while? Okay.
Switching back
Could
and
you
forth.
do your magic touch there, Nima?
There you go. No, I think I broke it.
Don't say that, Nima. That's funny. It's only 150 people sitting here. Who cares?
Fingers crossed.
There, my screen blinked at least.
All right, got it.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dig into a little bit to some real-world code so that you can see what this stuff actually looks like. So let me just start this little thing I have here. You see that white screen there? You saw it, right? Was that a ghost? No. Exactly right. Talk about this. So now, anytime now would be a really good time for this to work. Maybe it was a ghost. Better. So I wanted to highlight these two lines that I have there where you do a security principle. And this time I said I want a user prompt security principle. And then when I have that in hand, I can create the client. And the client is the gateway to everything in this SDK. The client is the vehicle for authentication. Once you have created yourself a client, you can do whatever you want. But the client needs authentication. So here I just did the name thing. I'm not showing you all those details because it's none of your business, really. In a good sense. But the white screen, the white rectangle that you saw was Microsoft not being able to understand that it shouldn't actually show anything if it's using a cached token. And since I ran this before the show, just to make sure that everything was all right, the token is actually cached, so it doesn't prompt me for anything. If this were the first time I did this, or I'm using another name, then it would come up there and say, okay, give me your, this is your name. what is the password that you have stored with Azure Active Directory? And then it would go ahead and do the authentication there. But at this point, we have authenticated. Okay, let's do this. Yeah. See, the problem with this is that my keyboard doesn't have a function keys row. So I keep doing the wrong thing, so let's hope that this will now step into here. There. I'll step into that as well. Did I hit it? Come on. Where is my thing going? Continue. There. So first, let's just skip over this. I look like a complete dork doing this. Okay, so here's the first time that we're going to do a query. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a relational entity set called of type product category. If I hover over this and do an F12, I can actually see what the definition of that type is. And you know, what we see here is not rocket science. This is what's known as a POCO, plain old C# object. It's a POCO, as we like to say. The cognoscenti call them POCOs, even though they're not objects, they're classes, but let's not make that distinction. So really what they are, they have constructors without parameters, and they have very, very simple properties with setters and getters for the individual fields that are stored. There is some information that you can add here to govern how this is understood. So in this case, so this Microsoft usage is just to get rid of some compilation errors. But here you can see that this field is not mandatory. And there's a localization ID and so on. Let's take a little more complicated scenario. So here we have stuff that relates this particular category to the product. And this is all wired up through these relationships that we have persisted here. Normally, you would not have to think about this because we have done all that work for you. If you're using the out-of-the-box entities, all this is wired up for you. You don't have to think about it at all. I just wanted to show you for the sake of completeness. Okay. So let's do this. It worked. So now we're going to talk about the result of this thing. And the result is an operations result, which has some semantics. And it's also an I-read-only list of product categories. Okay? And the query result is null here. And then we're going to do an await of the execution. So this is actually, we talked about this batch thing, right? And what we did here was exactly that. This went out into the batch and actually did it and packaged all the results together and sent the results back into this query result that's passed as an out parameter. Okay, let's go one step further. Now we're going to delete some stuff. In fact, we're going to delete everything that we found. So for all the results, we're going to put into the delete executor this particular entry. Now, what happens here? Anyone volunteer some information? Are we actually deleting something?
No, you're not. You're adding it to some internal list that we actually deleted.
Absolutely right.
What happens if somebody already deleted?
What?
What happens if somebody else has already deleted?
Then optimistic concurrency would take its part, and you would be notified by an exception. Okay, so now we've deleted things because we did execute async. And these operations, you know, they're pretty quick. The network is pretty quick about this thing. So now let's insert some stuff. And notice again, these are POCOs, right? So you can create instances of these just as you can anything else. So here, let's create a surface, which is in the surface produce, whatever. Oh, these are categories. Okay, the surface category, and so on. So create those. And this means also that the IntelliSense will just work, right? It's hard to see, I know, but all of this will just work at any time because they're a plain old C# class. Anything you do with a debugger, you can do with these. because they're not special in any way. Okay, we have sort of deferred discussion a little bit about this await. So can anyone tell me why is this cool? What happens in an await? What is an async method?
I've done a lot of programming around that as well. It's just X++. Async allows you to basically put the execution off on the other threads potentially, and the await waits in this thread for that execution.
Yeah. So that of course is a little bit simplified, but let me see if there's nothing wrong in anything you said. It's exactly right. But let me give it a little more spin to it. So what happens when you do an await is that the system will generate a delegate for you, and it'll fire off that delegate and then continue and then return. And when that delegate says I am done, it'll come back into the execution space that it just left and do the continuation of the point where it was. And the way that the C# code does this is enormously interesting, and unfortunately it's very hard to follow, because they generate a lot of temporary names that start with angles. They make it difficult to follow exactly what goes on. But this is really what goes on. It doesn't have to be on another thread, but often it is. Often it is. But the point here is that you don't make blocking calls. The calls that you make go from being blocking, so I have to sit back and wait and say, okay, I'm going to send this package over there, it's going to do its thing, and then it's going to come back, and when it comes back and unpacks all its stuff, then I can go on doing something else. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. As soon as you do this await, it'll return, and then when the results come back, I'll act on it. So that you can reuse the processors that you have for other things in the meantime while you're waiting for this to happen. And anyone who's done any sort of UI development on anything, like phones or anything else, how many have done that? A few of you, 10% of you. You know that this paradigm is extremely, it's crucial, in fact, on constrained devices to get the performance that you want, because you can't have blocking calls on a phone when you just can't use the UI because it's frozen, right? So there it serves the same purpose. Excuse me. Yep, so let's step on with this. Okay, so now I did my setup, and let's do another query here. So what I'm doing here is I want to say all the product categories that have the name electronics, I want to order them and do a projection. So here we have a lambda. Now, what is a lambda? There is a very, very precise definition that I'm going to give you. It's an anonymous function. That's all it is. That is what a lambda is. So why do we call it lambdas? Why don't you call it something else like anonymous functions? Well, that's because the industry is seeped in lore and history. So back in the 1950s, there was some deep thinking about what a function really is. And a means to express this was formulated, and it had the Greek letter lambda. You would say lambda x dot and then the function body. And those wouldn't have any name. They would just express what the function is. And in that way, they were allowed. It was possible to reason over what a function actually is and what it means to apply a function, what it means to replace parameters and all that stuff. It was work in Cambridge by a person called Church, Alonzo Church, did this groundbreaking work. And because he used the lambda, Greek letter lambda, that was later taken up in the 1955 by the people who invented the first functional programming language called Lisp. And in Lisp, there's a keyword called lambda, lambda, where it expresses the same thing. It's an anonymous function. And the developers of C#, being who they are, have deep backgrounds in functional programming. And they sort of said, okay, let's call them lambdas. Let's not call them anonymous functions, because when I talk about them, I talk about them as lambdas. That's why we call them lambdas. So now, next time you're at a cocktail party, you can bore somebody to tears and talk to them about, lambdas. But anyway, so this is just a lambda saying that the name is electronics. So can we just go back a little bit and say, what happens here when we try to execute this query? What is the role of this lambda? It's never actually executed. You're never executing this function. What happens is that we, at the back end, we look at this lambda and we take it apart and we say, how do I generate an expression from this? In this case, it's very easy. You just generate an expression where you say name equals to electronics. But there's reasoning that goes about this particular lambda. It's never actually executed. It's a placeholder for a function. And that's really a crucial point to make. The same thing for link. It's a crucial point to understanding how this thing works. So the JSON document that Nima showed you before is actually a result of understanding this expression, not executing it. Never. It's never executed. So here you're order by ascending. Here's another lambda. The result of this function is an array of objects. And again here you are providing pc.categoryID. Do I ever make a dereference of PC here? Never in a million years. I'm just specifying to the back end that this is the field I want. And why am I doing it in this way? Why can't I just do category ID? Because the compiler wouldn't know where it belongs. And here I have all the goodness of IntelliSense. You see? Description, all that good stuff that I can do here. That's the benefit of doing it this way. And then I do my projections where I select the fields, and the same thing applies here. And so on. Okay. Let's do this. Let's do this. And then you can go through this, and with any luck, this thing will actually show something. Yeah, electronics, whatever it is. So it actually fetched the correct records. So let's take a look at this query result. So here I'm specifying the exact type of this because it's just a particular entity. Right. By the way, when you are working with the SDK, we use the word entity set to denote a table, and an entity is just a record in that. I know that's confusing. That's just unfortunately the situation we're in now. In the portal, we talk about entities as really entity sets, but okay. I may make it difficult to follow. But anyway, here we can easily say what the type of this query result is. It's a relational list of product categories. But there are certain situations where you end up in a quagmire because the result of something cannot be expressed in the language itself. Wow. How the heck does that work? That's why we have var in the C# language. You thought var was just an excuse for lazy programmers, right? No, there's deep theoretical underpinnings to having var, because you can use it to express types or variables of types that can't be expressed in the language itself. This comes into pictures with group bys and aggregate functions and so on. So var really plays a crucial role there. Okay? Okay, let's do some more. Bore you to tears. Here's an inner join where we do join between products and product categories. There's not much interesting there other than the fact that now we are returning tuples. So pairs of product and product category. In fact, today there will be better support for tuples in an upcoming C# version, so we may actually rework this a little bit, but for now that's what it looks like. So we take item 1 and item 2 out of the tuples, and here it's figures mid-range speakers is a part of the electronics category, I guess. Okay, let's see if we have anything else. Inner zip is just a Cartesian product. I'm not going to go into that. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to stop here. So any questions on this simple run-through? Did it seem difficult? Abstract. There is, I will not lie to you, I'm not in the business of marketing. I wonder if I should have said that. But there is a learning curve involved in this. There's no doubt about it. And if you're new to C# and if you're new to async methods and you are new to lambdas and so on, then there is a steep learning curve. The good thing is that there's hundreds of books out there that describe exactly how this works, so you should get started easily. How many of you don't feel comfortable with async methods and lambdas and all that stuff that I went through? Not many. Not many. That's good. Okay, so let's see. Yes, go ahead. Yep. Well, it's a read-only because once you've made the query, you don't ever want to change the result. You don't want, it's an immutable set of results, right? That's why it's an I read-only. What alternatives would you suggest?
No, I'm just curious if there were any advantages. I mean, if one maybe worked as
I don't know. I don't know exactly. But I do know that you will get into situations where you will not be able to express this type. So you'll have to use var. I'll make sure that I... Yes, sir?
So in your example, you were querying the CDM. You were not querying Dynamics 365. You were querying
Yes.
the CDM.
That's correct.
So, I mean, there could be some data sync
Yeah, absolutely.
between the CDM or CDS and 365, but your app was working on the data that's in the CDM.
That is correct. And the app that I had there didn't know anything about where that data came from. It didn't care at all, right?
It doesn't know Dynamics 365.
It doesn't. Doesn't. So? Yep.
So you talked about those simple C# classes.
Yep.
Based entities that you don't have to write anything that's simple. Can you talk a little bit about extending those and like even if adding a custom extension fields in existing entity or custom entity? How you go about it? I mean, is it the same as creating an object and then the SDK or do you have
That's a good question. The question was, if I add a field to an out-of-box entity, how is it reflected in the actual code? There's two answers to it. Either you do a... Yeah, what is the answer?
So, I mean, there's two things we can talk about.
You see, two things.
A custom entity, and we can talk about customization on out-of-box entities. Either of those things, the experience of doing that is in the portal. And then being able to use that from the SDK, it involves building a similar POCO C# object as you saw with attributes, etc. You could do it manually based on documentation, but we could also work on automating that for you so that something that you've created in the portal, you can get the C# representation and use it.
So the question was, what about OData? Couldn't we do all this with OData? Yeah, so what the heck is this? Sorry. This was not what I intended. I get Arnold Schwarzenegger here. It's really not what I wanted here. Let's hope we don't get any of that. Okay, sorry about that. Let me pick up my thoughts here a little bit. What was the question? OData, right. So yes, we do. We will actually ship an OData feed as well, where you can use the OData request to against CDS data. It's just different than this is. We will have both sides of that coin, so that you can build your little app in Android and fire away an OData request as well. Was that the answer you're looking for? Well, exactly because... Yeah. Well, that's because business logic is different from fetching data. As soon as you fetch your data into where you're doing your business logic, you want to be able to act on it in a type-safe way. You want to be able to say, my account.debit equals 55, right? You want this to be a type-safe experience, not just some nebulous thing that travels over the network. If you only wanted to fetch data, only wanted to deal with data, that would be perfectly applicable. But the world that we're in means that we have to actually build business logic that does something useful for the user. And OData does not cut it there. It's not enough. It's great, but it's not enough. That's why we went with this particular JSON representation. Yeah?
So are you saying that you cannot inherit the class to add additional fields if you have custom fields?
Going back to the previous question, yes, you can take the class that's provided from the SDK and extend it and add your fields to it and use that class instead.
In fact, when I'm done with this demo, we will look into some code that will show you another way of doing this. So let's go there. Okay. So, sure.
Will you be sharing any example of template for extending this SDK?
For extending the SDK? What do you mean extend? Using or extending? Using. Yes. So what we will be doing is that we will be building a cookbook that says, okay, here's CRUD. So if you want to insert stuff, here is the first example. You want to insert is not that interesting, but let's do something else like read, right? So here's your basic read, and here's when you do order by. Okay, now we do group by, and now we do aggregate functions, and now we do this, that, and the other, so that we have sort of a cookbook thing that we're going to publish about how to do this to give you a better start, specifically for those who have a learning curve ahead of them, which is going to be painful. We're going to publish that on...
So for Q2, or close to the end of Q1, maybe after Q1, we have a private preview program that we would share with anybody who's interested. We would ask you to have, I guess, business scenarios or prototypes ready. We can discuss. So send either of us email, and we can pursue that. After that, when we actually release the SDK, the documentation will be released on one of our portals where the rest of our documentation is.
Okay. All right, now comes another demo that I go into with some trepidation. So my wife told me that it may be time that I lose some weight. And I will not comment on that, other than saying, yes, but if I do that, I need a band. So the company was kind enough to give us a band, and it's cool, but I said, yeah, it's not really enough. I wanted sort of this app to see what's going on in my band. And I wanted to learn about Xamarin as well. So I said, let me build an app in Xamarin that allows me to monitor the data that comes from this thing. So I did that, and it was a lot of fun, and I spent more time sitting doing that app than I was on the treadmill, which was probably very predictable. But I ended up with this app that you see here, and it's running on my phone. You can see it here, and it's mirrored sort of. Here you see all the compounded data. Here's some gauges. The stuff in green is where you want the effort to be, and there's warnings when you go outside. All sorts of good stuff. So where does all this leave us now? Well, I built a little bit of interface to CDS. So let me start this guy here. And with a little bit of luck, it should show my, there, you see, I'm cool. I'm calm here, right? But we're going to change that. So could you shift between the BPM
speed
and the speed?
Got it.
So as I noted with some of my colleagues from India who, as you know, are obsessed with cricket, this space from here down there to the end is almost exactly the same as when you do a run in cricket. So you do your bowling, the guy is standing in front of the wicket and he hits it and you go back and forth. So here it goes. You remember I said not anything on the owl? So here we go, let's do it. So with any luck, you should be seeing some speed going on here. That's 2 runs. Thank you. The things that I do for this company. Okay. Now I'm going to press this guy here. And what's going to happen is, I'm going to show you the code in a few minutes. Excuse me. I logged all this data, and I put it in some data storage here. I'm going to wrap that up, and I'm going to send it to an Azure function that's going to deal with it. So let me find that. Are you all aware of what the Azure functions do? Talk about it, could you? While I do
Yeah,
this?
so Azure Function is the service that hosts very easy to write script-based functions. And we have enabled the SDK to run there. So like all you have to do is write a few lines of code, and you're able to, from a client, make a call into Azure Function that goes over to SDK.
Yep. So that's exactly what we did here. And in a few seconds, here it is, you will see what this Azure function looks like. So, what? It's not it. Did I end up the wrong place? This is not the right place. Okay, I will find that for you, but in the I'll just talk to what it does first. We'll take this as an example, and then I'll show you the code a little bit later. So what you do in an Azure function is you have one method, which is called run, which is passed a message, and you can optionally log stuff in there. And it returns a task, and it's very simple. When you hit this thing, you can get the queries, and you can add on it. And what I did was, in here, I just took the list of biometrics that I captured when I did my run. I unpack them, and I do inserts into CDS with this particular data. So I just want to do this one more time to see if... Nima, could you proceed with the presentation while I just do this?
Okay. Just
Talk
explain.
about the status that where we are at.
Okay.
This is the next slide. And for God's sakes, remove my screen here.
Okay. All right. So I actually don't have it set up, but I can talk.
You talk
through
about
it.
the status anyway.
Sounds good. So in terms of what we've done so far, you have fairly good support for data access. Things that we're working on right now are things like notifications and triggers that Peter mentioned. We're a little bit in the starting phase of that, but what that will enable is there's two sets of scenarios that it'll enable. So there's notifications, which means when business events happen on your data, you will be able to get code triggered and running to take that change and propagate it to other systems. That's the first thing that we will tackle, and we'll probably deliver fairly soon. The second thing is a little bit more complicated. It's the concept of triggers. This is logic that you run as part of the business event happening. So, for example, let's say an account is being created, and you want your code to run as part of that creation, to maybe validate it, or do some kind of defaulting. This is something we could do with X++ fairly easily, right? You just write some X++, it just gets run as part of the same transaction. In this case, it's going to be a little bit different. It's very much web-based. So the business event triggers a function or some CDS code, and that will put other things into that same transaction. That's, again, triggers, and this is something that we'll deliver a little bit later.
Yeah, so could you switch over to mine?
It's already yours.
I already have it?
Is it not?
Okay, good. Hopefully it won't take too long. I'm sorry about that. Something happened, but now I think we're good. If this thing will turn on, please? Yes. Okay, so this is the web function, the Azure function that we talked about. So here I'm taking the security token string that I sent as part of the payload. So remember what the authentication looks like here. I authenticated on my phone. You didn't see it because, again, I had it cached. I already done it once just to make sure that everything worked this morning. So there wasn't any user interface saying, please authenticate. But if I hadn't done this before on this device, or if it had grown stale because it hadn't been used for a while, then a UI would appear and say, now use your password. And since this is running against, we'll probably do two-factor authentication even. But I didn't have to do that now, but I do send the security token over the wire as well as part of the thing, right? So that's that. And then I have this payload that I passed, which is the biometric data that I captured while I was running. And what I do is I take that JSON document and I deserialize it. There's a thing called Newtonsoft that allows you to do that very easily. I can't actually improve. Can you see it reasonably well?
Can you zoom in?
What?
Can you zoom in?
No, you can't zoom it from in here. But maybe there's something else I can do. Maybe I can go here. Let's see if I can do the run from there. It's the same code. I think that's easier to read, isn't it? Much easier. Right, thank you. Okay, good. So then I create myself a client and I pass the security token string that came from the device where I authenticated. And then what I go ahead and do is I create myself a new exercise, and if I go into my Power Apps here, you will see that beforehand I created myself something called exercises, which has start time, end time, that's all, a name, right? So it's very simple. So create that, and then create a list of readings, the heart rate and speed at any particular second. Then I insert this guy. I don't actually do any database operations. I just insert it as a record that is interesting. Then I loop through all my readings. Come on. There. And I create myself a new metric. I put in the data from the payload, and then I create a reference and add the reference to there. So you have your one-to-n relationship set up. And then I do execute async. Boom, done. It's all updated in the database. And then I create a response saying, yeah, I did it, I'm fine. So now, with any luck at all, I would be able to go into my, here and say, what? I can open an Excel, I'll just do data, that's easier. Let's see. 1134, is that about right? Yeah. Thank God for that. And let's see if we can actually see some biometrics here. You see, the thing is, it's not entirely, sometimes it falls out, probably when I was at the back of the room. It couldn't read my heart rate. In fact, I'm not sure what this data is. It seems a little bit too low. Anyway, I'm sure it did work. So that was that app, and that was that demo. And I will just talk about the Xamarin thing, because Xamarin is a really, really cool thing. The app that I wrote there actually runs on Windows phones, as if anyone cared, and Android, and iPhones, and Universal Windows, so it could run on an Xbox as well. So, the investment that I made in writing this one app carries, you multiply it by 4 on the devices that it actually runs on. And it's a really cool thing, and I was really happy with the time that I spent there. As I said, the idea was that I was going to put this on the App Store and make $1 billion, and then I was going to buy a chateau in France and the Ferrari and all that from those proceeds. Yeah, but what happened was that they removed the support for the band, so that the API that you used to talk from this to this is removed now. You can't download it anymore. And then they said, okay, we're not really going to sell this anymore. We stopped selling it. So I said, okay, I might as well take my app and show it for a demo here. So that's what I did. So what time do we stop today?
I believe we had an hour.
We had 75 minutes. So we're done, right?
We're done, yeah.
Okay, so let me just start this. I talk too much, I know. My wife tells me all the time. So did we go through this? Set-based operations are not ready yet. It's one of the first things that we'll finish. It's too bad we don't have that. Aggregates don't work extremely well right now. Triggers notifications are something that we're working feverishly on. We'll have it ready. The contact info of the two gentlemen who have been doing the work for you today, Nima and myself, contact is there. Thank you. Thank you. So we got a little bit carried away here with that demo and the glitch that I had there. So we are actually done now. You all have things where you need to be and where you need to go. Thank you for being with us. But before you go, just remember that it means a lot to us that you go in and fill out the evaluations here. As a matter of respect to the people who are up here pouring their hearts out and trying to get you a head start on this, please go ahead and fill in those evaluations. It means a lot to us so that we can do a better job next time. Yes, sir?
Feedback session.
What?
Feedback session tomorrow.
Oh, yes. And by the way, if you want to hear more about this, there's a feedback session tomorrow, Wednesday, late evening or afternoon from 3.
3 p.m. at
In room 201 at 3. So be there, and we will be happy to talk to you about the SDK. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.